when you think of climate change. Yeah? So, for example, for me, when I think of climate change, Trump comes to mind. Yeah? He's very vocal about climate change, and you know for what reasons. So I would like to know what every panelist thinks about when they think about climate change.
When I think about climate change, I think about the change in weather patterns from the pre-industrial age to what we're experiencing right now. From the ancient times up to now, we've had consistent weather patterns in which the human race has relied upon for resources. But with the entrance of the industrial age, coal mining, and pollutants in the air that have increased the greenhouse gas effect, it means the weather patterns are not, they're unpredictable. Thus, we are facing an unprecedented time of resource scarcity, and as such, we have to find better measures of dealing with it.
When I hear climate change, I look at it as the need for collective effort to address like the negative impact of this particular climate change. And I look at the need to build capacities in order to address this particular issue to do with climate change.
So when I think about climate change, I think about how we are getting irregular rainfall patterns, how some countries in Europe are experiencing heat waves, how we are getting reduced stocks in terms of our agricultural produce. And when I think about climate change, I think about it as a problem that we can all solve. It starts with us, it ends with us. And I believe each one of us has the capacity to do something. And I believe we can start from acting now.
On climate change, when anyone mentions climate change, I am pulled to think about Miss Greta Thunberg. You may have heard about her or not. She's a 15-year-old Swedish citizen who boycotted school to demonstrate outside the Swedish parliament so that they could take climate change seriously. Now, she's 15 years old. If you try and remember the reasons that you came up with to your parents as not to go to school, I'm sure they are very varied and some of them very controversial. But for someone who's 15 years of age, we would term them as, I don't know whether there's something after millennials, but she's more millennial than we could possibly be. But for her to see the need that there is no point of me going to school if by the time I am done with my education, the world as we know it will be over. So she boycotts school to demonstrate outside the Swedish parliament. And this has started a worldwide revolution on climate change, whereby it is school strike for climate, right? So just like I said earlier, the environment and its conservation begins with us, so that by the time 1.4 million students around the world are demonstrating so that their various governments may adopt policies that are friendly towards the environment, it should spark a question in you on what are you doing about the environment, because the environmental conservation is important and climate change is actually real. I was able to discuss with some of my friends, and there are people who literally believe that climate change is propaganda. That climate change is propaganda that has been brought about by Democrats with an aim to control the corporate industry. Which, when you listen to it, I mean, really, July, as we have known it since we were children, July has been the coldest of months in Kenya. But how many can say that where they stayed, that it has been just like before, right? I come from a place where it rains continuously for 24 hours. Surprisingly, in July, there was not a single drop of rain for the first time in almost forever. So if such events do not spark questions in us, we begin to wonder what's the point of anything after all.
Those are very valid sentiments from all of you. And climate change is one of the things that the UN is really focusing on this year. And as such, for the International Day of Peace, which is observed on the 21st of September, the theme for this year is Climate Action for Peace. And that is in line with the topic under SDG 13, which is addressing climate change as a measure of building sustainable peace. Yes? So I'd like to get your thoughts on how climate change, how addressing climate change can lead to sustainable peace in the long run.
From what my colleagues have said, they're all correct. The one thing that we need to deal about climate change is the fact that due to the unpredictable weather patterns, humans are not able to get the resources they need. And furthermore, that would mean with the growing population that we have, you can imagine from the 1900s where we were only about 3 to 4 billion. Right now we are a population of 7 billion, but there is dwindling water supply, dwindling food supply. So the fight between nations for resources that will build industries will change to resources that will keep us alive. And that is the unprecedented crisis that we are going to face in the next few years. For the couple of weeks, the Amazon has been burning. Yet the rate of greenhouse gases has been rising. That means the number of trees to help us combat this is lowering, but nobody is having a conversation about. And this is something that we are going to deal with in the future. 2050, most of us will be having kids. They will have to deal with this problem. And the fact that if we do not deal with this problem, we will have conflicts based on resources. The panelist at the end, because of his interests, will be better versed to explain our resource-based conflict, but I believe that is the problem that we are heading to.
Really, I think when I look at climate change, I look at a goal I have, yeah? I want to go to places like the Bahamas, Maldives. However, they're subjected to submersion. And that in itself tells me we actually need collective efforts so that we can stop these particular things from happening. And when you tell us that climate action at the heart of United Nations discussions and all that, I also think that's relevant to peace. Because when we look at issues to do with sustainable peace, we come and look at peace building in terms of three aspects. There's the social aspect, which involves mobilization, psychological aspect, that's beliefs and values. We have social capital and cultures. Then we also have the political aspects, that is the governance, management, policies, legislation, legalities, and decision making. Then we forward into the economic aspect, which is mostly about development, resource distribution, and resource allocation. Yeah. And now when we look at addressing climate change as a measure of building sustainable peace, we need to understand that there are about 4 things we need to look at. We need to look at how gender is relevant to climate change. We need to look at resource conflict based on resource scarcity and resource abundance. And then there's the issue of climate refugees. And then there's also governance in relation to social protection programs and that type of thing. So when we talk about gender, how is gender relevant? We basically need to include both women and men at every single level towards collective effort in climate action. Yeah. And when I look at this, I say women are good at mobilizing, yeah, and also they're good at, they do things like homegrown activities, collecting firewood, this type of things. We need to educate them on how far they should collect, because we don't want them to overdo it in such a way that it's affecting us. We need to teach on afforestation, deforestation, these particular things to avoid them at par. And at the same time, when we look at men are known to acquire land and do different type of things. Therefore, we need both of them as complementary effort in order to actually deal with this particular climate change issue. And then when we talk about resource conflict, there's resource scarcity, which causes the issue of scrambling. Yeah. And that in itself brings about conflict, where now people can't even access it anymore because everybody's scrambling for it because it's too little for everyone to be able to sustain it. Then when we look at resource abundance, it brings in the aspect of exploitation, yeah? Where it's too much, everyone wants, where it's too much, the places like now, let me say, Africa has resources, it does, and that is exactly why the West is really after Africa. And that really shows the aspect of exploitation which has been happening in Africa. I hope we're at par on that one. When we look at climate refugees, there's long-term effects and there's sudden effects, you know. Natural disasters really do cause people to migrate. And in the international system, as of the moment, there's this thing of securitization of migration at the expense of human rights. see, people are migrating and governments are forced to accommodate these particular people and try to interact with these particular people at the expense of their human rights, where they're trying to create barriers and push away these people and those type of things. And then now, when it comes to governance, we look at governance in relation to social protection programs. See, policies and legislation bring in these programs in order to now create that protection aspect. Now, that protection aspect is what we need in order to advance these particular things. That shows every single sector is dealt with. That is from the governance to the people to the environment. And that's like a way to deal with all of it. Therefore, it actually is an important discussion.
For all of us to understand this topic, I'd like to give a case example of Somalia. So we all know Somalia has been in conflict for so long, right? And being in conflict means land degradation, right? So since they're in places where they can't farm and they can't get food, they have to move to places where they think there's better land for farming and for them to be able to sustain themselves. So they move into capital cities. So this results in population explosion. And when these people are around a place like that, it leads again to the same problem of land degradation, because they cut out areas meant for vegetation to be able to live, right? And now those areas become targets for the Al-Shabaab. For these young, uneducated, so to call them, and unemployed people who have nowhere to go, don't have anything to eat, they become the easy targets for radicalization. But now let's look at how we can address sustainable peace. So if we had farming, if we were to introduce farming to them, right, it will bring a sense of bonding, togetherness, because they are doing the activity together, right? Let's look at if we bring for them cattle rearing. If you go to Turkana, Garissa, you see the way they go to fetch water for kilometers. It's actually a culture for them because they bond. For you to bond with your neighbor who you don't know makes you easier to trust, makes you easier to share ideas, so you grow as a community. So I think the agenda is actually very valid, and until we put those measures in place, is actually when we are going to move forward.
On resource-based conflict, I'll try and avoid using countries. Okay, you see, when you're taught diplomatic practice, you're told that you have to be very careful what you say and where you say it, to the point of even using examples could offend somebody somewhere. So when resource-based conflict comes in terms of we're already depleting what we have, right? The limited that we have, because we have a population of 7 billion. And when you're told when your government, for instance, adopts a have one child policy, I'm sure there will be chaos in the country. Why should I have one child, right? Mostly some for religious reasons, some for posterity reasons, but for the many reasons, you see, that in itself has become a conflict, okay? So we are having a population of 7 billion. There is not enough to feed the 7 billion, but then when you're told to have just one kid to avoid having 10 and 20 and 30 billion people in the world, you don't want to do that. So now the one way that we can actually avoid such a conflict is by ensuring that we protect the environment that we have right now. We conserve the world as it is right now, because you shall find like right now, I was working on under Sharon in the PGA, and while I was working on a background guide for UNHCR, and something that came up was climate refugees, right? Is it becoming the world's greatest refugee crisis? You know, we've since we've been growing up and learning in school, and we know that political refugees or crisis refugees are the highest as we know them. So that Syria has a lot of them, and Somalia, and all these places with chaos. But however, we are getting to a point where people are moving because the places they live are no longer suitable for them anymore, right? So that, as the example Chris used of people in Somalia not being able to farm where they live, all right? So they have to move to places that they feel like will bring sustainability to their lives. So you see, now this also brings conflict, especially considering how the countries that people look to for protection, for been given the refugee status, because you also have to be recognized as a refugee by the host state. These countries are voting for very right-wing leaders who are completely anti-immigration, completely anti anything that is not their country. I don't want to go into the details of nationalism and fascism, but it is alarming that people will come, and by people I mean the West, will come, cause chaos in Africa, right? And then when Libyans start flowing into Europe, it becomes an immigration crisis, and all the countries want to shut down their borders. How about you leave Africans then to do what they were to do to begin with? So I feel like when it comes to climate change, it is becoming a leading cause of conflict. Right now, a country like Italy, I did a research on Italy's new government. They had a coalition government which consisted of a couple of parties. One which was very much anti-immigration, and the other one that was very anti-European Union. Now, you will remember that in the European Union has some of the most friendly refugee policies in the world. They are very welcoming. So now, when a country decides that they are going to vote for people who are anti-immigration and anti-EU, that tells you very clearly their policy on immigration itself, their policy on refugees. Now, in Libya, yes, the chaos in Libya is not due to climate change. Well, not per se. But you see, there's how you just cross things off your list. I will go to Italy if, when there's problems at home, you might want to solve them yourselves, all right? But then when sometimes the problems are just too many, you just want to go. So that there is political instability, there is insecurity, and then to top it all, there is climate change that is making sure no crops are growing in your place. You have not received rainfall. Your children are dying of thirst. So you just take your chance to cross over into Europe. And while you do that, this brings up another conflict because the Europeans don't want to take you. There have been NGOs that have been taken to court by governments. Apparently, the governments have accused them of going to the Libyan coast and filling their ships with refugees and then ferrying them and distributing them all over the European coast, which, well, I do not want to say is wrong. Okay, that's a whole other political aspect of it. But what has gotten these NGOs to this point? You understand? What has made these NGOs not feel like Libya can be salvaged, that Libya can be saved at this point that we are, that the best option is for people to exit, right? So when resource-based conflicts will go so far that they will become personal. At one point, you and your neighbor shall be arguing, shall be having conflict about tap water, because that is where we are heading right now.
So this is mostly a legal question. If you feel you have some legal knowledge to it, you might answer it. Currently, we have different international laws and treaties that seek to address climate change, such as the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, Convention for Climate Change, UNFCCC. But we find that most of these conventions and treaties are not effective because of ambiguity, because of sovereignty, issues regarding sovereignty. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on the same, as well as briefly discuss about climate injustice.
I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritties of the UFCCC, but it's made up of various agreements such as the Rio Declaration, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. The issue is not with the treaties themselves. The treaties have actually come up with a very nice framework for countries to follow. The issue is based on two concepts. The first is whether they're legally binding. For most, it's not, because they're suggestive. They give countries the impetus to actually implement them, but it does not uphold them to a standard. That means if a country chooses to go that way, it will. If it does not, there is no sanction that a country will ultimately face. And the second thing is the rate of implementation. Now, Kenya acceded to the Paris Agreement. We have NEMA. The question is, have you seen any action from NEMA to try implement the same in our country? No. The other day there was an expose on the Nairobi River it had to take the intervention of a media house to give a toxicity report for the river. That is NEMA's job. So it simply means that there has been zero to no integration of these agreements in the states. And therefore, it means that the agreements should foster two things. The first thing, it should put countries accountable. That means there should be sanctions for countries that fail to uphold the agreements. The second thing, there should be incentive. In a way that we should find a way to work with the public and public-private partnership where countries incentivize means to produce sustainable development. If a company, a green company, wants to work in Kenya, then I believe that it should tax liability should be reduced so that it can bring employment. At the same time, we tackle climate change. And finally, on climate injustice, the question is whether these so-called big countries, which are highly industrialized, should be held to the same standard. I believe they should be held to a higher standard. There is no reason why you should be a very high polluter, the countries like US, China, Japan, and we should hold you to the same standard as a country like Bhutan that has 90% forest cover. It makes no sense. Bhutan is not a problem, it is a solution, but the United States, these countries, they are the problem. They have pulled out of the agreement because they are putting corporate needs on top of human needs, and that will prove bad for us in the future. So I think that should be a solution for us.
I'll answer this by giving one particular statement at first, followed by a question. Good governance and equitable resource management is central to safeguarding peace, development, and environmental security. And if you've noticed, a place with good governance has issues like such less corruption, less insecurity matters, and those type of things. And at the same time, development and implementation of policy and legislation plays a really big role in determining how the outcome of peace and security will be. Now, I want to ask you a question. See, climate change largely affects developed countries. It does affect developed countries and underdeveloped countries, because if you look at underdeveloped countries, the effect is always so severe, yeah? And it's not because, it's not because the framework is not appropriate. It's simply because, look at Africa, for example, a large number of Africans are living under the poverty line. You want to tell me to stop deforestation. However, deforestation is what's sustaining my livelihood. Come on, like that, we need to deal with certain issues in order to avoid making other big issues, yeah? So what I'm saying is the framework is perfect. On paper, the framework is doing the job on paper. Before our eyes, it's really good. However, the real thing on the ground is implementation. Implementation is a problem because, look at Africa. We have the people who are involved in deforestation and issues that affect climate have not gone through quality education, and they are battling illiteracy. That is the problem in Africa. We need to stop thinking way big and actually get into the bottom line and say we need to teach people. See, implementation without teaching people will not help at all, because a person only implements as far as they are taught and as far as they understand. And if that does not happen, then there's no way you're going to expect change at any point whatsoever. Yeah. And also, when we look at this thing called sovereignty, I have being in school has taught me that the UN creates these frameworks as suggestions and all that. However, they're supposed to be law. These things are supposed to be implemented. And there's a clash between sovereignty and how the UN works. And that in itself is a problem, let's be real, because Africa in itself is unstable. And you're trying to give an unstable country a suggestion. That does not make sense at any point whatsoever. And I think when ambassadors go and sit in a room and decide, let's suggest this for our countries, that does not work at all, because you're trying to create something for people who don't even understand what you're sitting in a room for. That in itself is so irrelevant, and I think that's what they need to work into. And if you look at climate change, it's at the heart of all these goals that they're creating. climate change, once a person comes up with a project related with climate change, it creates employment because it involves everybody else to come in. Employment reduces poverty, employment deals with food security, all these particular things, all these things are intertwined. Therefore, it needs to look at, and then you're creating a framework that's supposed to be associated with the peace and justice institutions that exist within underdeveloped countries. Seriously. Do you know that our laws don't even apply to our own people? And we say we're sovereign? Like, come on, I think these people don't think about how severe a certain issue is before they create a framework. And you can't tell me consent is at the expense of sustaining a livelihood. Because honestly, if you can't sustain my livelihood and you want me to do something based on consent, there's no way we're going to agree. And that's one thing the UN needs to know. And that's one thing Africa needs to know as well. Sorry, let me just end with climate injustice. See, I hear this thing, okay, before I do that, there's this thing that I hear most Africans saying, if I was in that leadership position, I would change this. Let me be the one to tell you, if you cannot change it from where you sit, you'll go to that leadership position and make it way worse than what it was. And when we look at climate injustice, people say, my rights end where yours begin, something like that. If you are involved in something that curtails the right and sustaining livelihood of somebody else, then your rights do have to end so that somebody else's rights can begin. Let's be relevant. Where an injustice is, then the person has to be held accountable. And that means their right has to be limited so that they stop creating that particular thing. Let's create legislation policies. Let's create laws that actually hold these people accountable and pull them away from making these mistakes.
To comment on what you've said, let me first start by enlightening guys on something we are doing. So I'm the student focal leader for the UN environment for a program called the Kenya Green Universities Network. Now what we are doing is we are working on 4 work streams, and work stream number 1 is greening campuses. So this is making sure we plant trees, we landscape, waste is segregated at source, all those things. Source number 2 is greening the curriculum. So how do we include environmental studies, sustainability studies into the curriculum? So now we are working closely with the Commission for University Education. When I say we, I mean DESTA, and also the Kenya Institute for Curriculum Development. Mainstream number 3 is behavior change. So how do we bring about behavior change in forums like this, right? Conferences. So we have dialogues with different people, tell them what you're doing is wrong, this is what you're supposed to do, and we move the conversation forward. The 4th one is community participation. Is there anyone from JKUAT here? Volume. Is there anyone from JKUAT here? Or Karatina University? Oh yeah, so like JKUAT, for example, they have community centers where they interact with the community, right? Yeah, so we are recommending each university to have such a community center, so that they can come tell you what we feel is not being done right in the environment is 1, 2, 3. So how do we make it change? How do we educate the community? The reason I'm saying this is, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a presidential directive that is being implemented by NEMA and KICD to make sure that climate change is going to be taught from all levels, starting primary school, primary class 1. Yeah, so now that's going to come with the CBC. Now, allow me to read for you 2 policies, yeah, which we suggested. So we need to integrate climate information into government policies, as climate is a major driving factor for most economic activities in Kenya. So now why are we doing this? It's because we want to strengthen systems and agencies and implementation of those same policies, thus gaining resilience in the face of preventable yet debilitating change, right? So I do agree with all what they've said, but the biggest problem is implementation. Now, I really think with the Kenya Green Universities Network, we are going to try see how we are going to bring all these things on board.
On United Nations and you know, these international conventions on environment, one thing, the weakest, it's you know, when you do research on weaknesses of international law, the one thing that you find is that it does not have an enforcing agency, right? So that we shall meet, we shall send delegations of up to 90 to a convention and tell them to discuss in the environment, and they will come up with a very good resolution paper. However, when they come back home, we never hear about it. Understand? So now implementation is quite a problem because also of issues to do with sovereignty. I am one of the greatest defenders of sovereignty in school because I believe that each nation has its people, and its people have a right to decide how they should be ruled, right? But then at the same time, do you notice the lack of public awareness on environmental and climate change, especially even in our own country, in Kenya, for instance? Other than the recent exposés done by Royal Media and was it Nation Media? Other than that, we have not, I mean, you see, as how many have seen an advert on TV that is trying to promote environmental preservation and climate change, creating awareness on Kenyan television? They are not there. Why? Because they are bad for business, right? So while we are trying to implement them, we also have to understand that government has how it works. We do not expect that one morning the government will wake up and say we have banned all plastics and you can no longer package in plastics, because then we shall have an economic crisis and then we shall have something new to complain about. So yes, we should be doing something about it, and it is a slow process, but what we want is for these government institutions to at least start, because we are running out of time.
Kindly, if you have any questions for the panelists, you can find them after this, and then you can ask your burning questions. And yeah, you've been an awesome audience, and we will see each other again.